Well, welcome to the Monday Minute of the Hunt Backcountry podcast. These are shorter and more informal episodes where we answer your listener questions. And today I am going solo. Steve is out on his moose hunt in Idaho with Justin. And so I'm just going to take some time to answer some questions that I can speak to. It is, early October as we're releasing this. Many of you guys are also out hunting, which is fantastic. Just want to remind you guys that we do have the EXO Experience Photo Story contest going on. You can get all the details at exomountaingear.com/experience, or there'll be a link in the show description for that. But just a reminder on this, it's not a trophy photo contest. It's not a kill the biggest buck or bull. You don't have to be a professional photographer. The intention behind this contest is to kind of capture the whole hunt and tell a story with photos. And pretty much all of us these days have smartphones with decent cameras that can do a good job. So check that out if you're interested. We're giving away some great prizes. We have some different categories and things like that. But again, all those details will be at that link. To dive right into some questions, a topic that came up recently, it wasn't so much a question, but it was more of, just a topic or a remark as I was speaking with someone about their hunts. And they were talking about how time was just totally different when they were out on their hunts and how it moved slower and what a stark contrast that was from day-to-day life. And this is certainly something I've thought about, of course experienced, but also thought intentionally about it. Just in terms of the fact that, yes, when you are hunting, in particular when you're doing a multi-day backpack hunt, time is totally different than our day-to-day lives. And sometimes it does take 2 or 3 days to kind of settle into a new rhythm as you're out on an extended hunt. But that's not always the case. There's different aspects or ways you could look at this topic. But one thing to point out and think through, because I want to broaden this topic outside of just hunting, is that when we're doing something new and novel, something different, something that demands more of us than our day-to-day life, that is going to change our level of awareness and intention and presence, and that alone changes how we are perceiving time. If we are busy at our day job, whatever that is, I mean, some guys are behind a computer typing, some guys are behind heavy equipment moving, some guys are visiting with patients, right? Like maybe in a medical setting. But we become familiar with whatever we do most. And as we're familiar with it, we are executing unintentionally very often. And we're doing things we've done a lot, things we're familiar with. And as we do that, we have less awareness, less presence, less intention. Our senses are engaged less. And therefore, time is just moving quicker, right? When we get out and experience something new and novel, and something in particular that also pushes us in a unique way, we are just fully enveloped in that. We're in more demand of being present and aware, and that changes our perception of time. So that happens when you go from being a number cruncher with a spreadsheet to then hunting elk with your bow. But it can happen in so many different ways if you just put yourself in situations to experience something new and or experience something that's going to require more of you. And so if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, obviously this applies to hunts, but it also applies to things that we do with like the death hike. I was reminded of it just this weekend when I went out for a long mountain bike ride. And it wasn't so much the ride itself, but it was the way that this day unfortunately came about, where I ended up completely slashing a tire, repaired it, but ultimately my repair failed. And I found myself 22 miles from my truck. with an unrideable bike. And again, it's not a situation that you would want per se, but it demanded certain things of me. So making that repair demanded certain things. Adapting to being 22 miles from my truck with no cell service made me adapt in certain ways. Handling how to react to the situation and come up with a plan and take the best course of action. All of these things are things that would not happen normally in my day-to-day life, doing, say, a podcast even, or doing other work that I do as part of my job. And in all reality, not only does this slow down time for those moments, but here's a big key I think that gets overlooked. It's easy to talk about creating memories, but memories are created from experiences like that. And at the end of the day, the more memories we create, the more that we realize our use of time from a macro level. So if we step outside of, hey, a day of archery elk hunting moves slower, I'm more present, I'm more aware. Also from a macro level, the years of our lives will feel more full, more used, more known as we go have new experiences and make more memories. So I know that's a bit kind of a rant, if you will, but just to remind you guys, even now in the midst of hunting season, but again, hunting seasons are short. They're only part of the year. Use all of the rest of the year. Engage with your family, friends, whoever, and the more memories you go make, the more new experiences you have, the more ways that you kind of get yourself out of routine and comfort zone and all of that. At the end of the day, that's all going to create a more full, a more memorable life, and you're going to not have any difference in terms of the number of hours in a day or the number of years in your total life, but you're going to feel that you got a lot more out of those hours, weeks, months, and years of your life by having those new experiences. So anyway, that was a topic that came up. We will dive into listener questions, starting with this one from Riley. He says, first, how has it been using the Swarovski STC or ATC spotting scopes? And hypothetically, after your experience, would you hesitate to give up your Swarovski ATX in favor of the more compact scope? And Riley did send this question directly to my attention through the podcast, so I'll answer it today. So one clarification first, I have the ATS 65, not the ATX. Both are good scopes in all of the side-by-sides that I've done, even though that ATS is the older model. It's always met my eye better. I feel like it's a slightly better scope optically, at least for my eye, compared to the ATX. And it's a bit lighter. Obviously, it doesn't have the modularity that the ATX does. So if that's something that you want, the ATX could be a choice over the ATS. Saying all that gets blended, S and X. But yes, I have the ATS. I absolutely love that scope. But to get to his primary question, having spent time now with the STC and ATC, which are the super compact versions of Swarovski spotting scopes, which, to be fully candid, did not exist when I bought my ATS, so they are newer. And they weren't a decision factor when I purchased my ATS, because again, they were not on the market. I have used the STC, so that's the straight compact, and the ATC, which is the angled compact. They are noticeably more compact. The name implies, like, they just pack down super simple. They fit into nooks and crannies. If you put them in something about, if you put them in a dedicated spotting scope pocket, such as like on RK4 packs, they just get swallowed by it. They're tiny, compact, great little scopes that are going to compete, in that category with like a Kowa 55. Obviously, there's other compact, like Vortex razors, etc. Would I give up my ATS for an STC or ATC? Personally, yes, I would, without feeling like I'm missing much. As we talk a lot about when it comes to spotting scopes and which to choose, whether we're talking brand, but more so just in a broad category of sizing, is the spotting scope you have with you is the best spotting scope on the market, period. So if a larger spotting scope and the weight and size of that is going to keep you from carrying it as much, it's not an effective spotting scope anymore. So if going to something like the STC or ATC, or again, something in that class, is going to enable you to carry that more, or you're just practically going to make that decision to carry that weight more, then it's inherently going to be a better spotting scope. And for the vast majority of people, they are not doing make or break decisions of their hunt with a spotting scope. So of course, there's always these caveats of, are you judging sheep? Are you judging goats? Are you a diehard trophy guy who's counting minutia and inches on a buck or a bull? Like, there's always going to be cases where bigger is better, or bigger may even be mandatory. But at least based on the context we've seen for us personally with a lot of guys we hunt with, and then even just knowing the audience of this podcast, that's not generally the case. And so the STC or ATC, they're amazing little spotting scopes. I would gladly take one. I love my ATS for sure. I love it enough that I obviously haven't sold it and run out to buy something smaller. But if you had to make me trade, no big deal. I'd just go keep hunting. They're great little scopes. So that's how I look at that. I would not hesitate necessarily to give up my ATS for the ways that I hunt most often for an ATC, for example. Riley had a second question. He said, I may need to move for work and start flying for my hunts each year. So I was curious about what you found to be the best option for transporting your meat and antlers home when flying. He said, if it makes a difference in your answer, I'm only interested in mule deer. Yeah, it is good to know he's only interested in mule deer, because this does get a little bit more complicated with larger animals, both in terms of quantity of meat, but obviously in terms of antler size. Flying home with, even a really 200-inch mule deer buck, like a really bomber buck, is going to be different than flying home with a giant caribou, giant moose, giant elk, etc. Yeah, this is there's a lot on this topic. We've touched on it. There's no definitive resource I can point you to per se, because the conditions, the context, the details are always going to matter. They're going to influence the best way, the quote unquote best way to get meat or antlers home. So let me just give you a few options or things to think about. One is, you can generally check, especially like in context of mule deer, but I've done this with a 300 plus inch bull elk, just checked the skull and antlers. When you do that, as a caveat, you always want to look at the airlines, guidelines, recommendations, but in general, most of those may have a limitation on size. So one, keep that in a factor. And then two, the way that you want to prepare this would be to do a couple things. One is, there cannot be any fluid. So the skull needs to be as clean as possible, ideally internal brain matter, etc., removed, all that good stuff. And then you want to take additional steps to completely seal that. So like when I've flown, for example, take a really good like contractor grade bag and wrap that skull really tight, get it airtight, obviously liquid tight, etc., with a couple layers there. In addition to doing that from the skull, I'm then going to take some plastic like cling wrap or packaging, material, and then you're going to be wrapping not only the skull, but then also the antlers All antler tips generally need to be protected and can't protrude from any sort of that protection or packaging. So cutting layers of cardboard, I've seen guys do it by cutting pieces of hose, but you essentially need to make sure that all tips are protected and that they are not a hazard of puncture in any way. So you end up with a skull and antlers that are wrapped in plastic, and again, that are protected generally with additional cardboard, rubber, plastic, etc. So there's no sharp points. And I've, again, just taken those and checked them as items on hunts flying home. Obviously, you get into larger animals. If you're meeting restrictions on overall size, you can look at doing things like splitting skulls or splitting off a horn or antler in this case, and then being able to reattach that back to the skull. So there's some finer details you can get into, but I would say in general, if we keep this in mule deer context, you're going to be able to get that thing relatively clean. I don't mean it needs to be like fully Euroed, but get it clean of meats, fluids, stench, etc. Wrap it really well, and you should be able to check that in some form or fashion. Again, check with your airline. What gets trickier with meat, really a lot of this is just going to depend on the end of the hunt and the start of your flight and the duration of time that you have in between to, one, take care of things, but two, get things frozen or not. If you have meat that is frozen, you are making your job so much easier. And so it is difficult to say, hey, I'm going to fly to X state, like say Montana, and I'm going to go on a 10-day hunt. And at the end of my 10-day hunt, maybe I kill an animal on day 7 or whatever, right? And it's hanging or it's in a cooler at camp or what have you. But at the end of my 10-day hunt, I'm going to go from the field to maybe a hotel to then the airport the next morning and fly home, and I have meat that's not frozen. That's a more difficult proposition. If things are frozen, you just have a lot more options. One thing I will mention, especially as this relates to meat, it is relevant to the antler conversation as well, but Alaska Air Cargo, longtime listeners of the podcast have heard us mention this in numerous forms or fashion, but essentially Alaska Air Cargo is a cargo-specific service where you are checking items of cargo, in this case meat and or antlers, onto flights. They're flying on passenger flights, so it's not a separate cargo flight per se, but they're booked totally separately, and the process is totally separate from booking your seated passenger flight. In general, Alaska Air Cargo, you have to pre-register and pre-register as a business for the most part to become what's called a known shipper to use this service. But if you can do that, which is something that we've done, and you become a known shipper through Alaska Air Cargo, this process, again, gets even more simple and generally more cost effective as well. So I've used Alaska Air Cargo in the lower 48 to say get elk meat from one state to another, and we've used it pretty extensively to get items home from Alaska to the lower 48 as well. What gets tricky with Alaska Air Cargo and why I kind of have like some maybes and caveats in there is different Alaska Air Cargo offices seem to be more or less strict than others in terms of getting things checked in and booked and into the system. So I've heard from some people who are like, yeah, I'm not registered as a known shipper. I just went to Alaska Air Cargo office at X airport and I was able to book a shipment. I've heard of people doing that, but I've also heard of plenty of instances where if you're not a known shipper, you can't use Alaska Air Cargo. So I would just say if at all possible, if you can look at Alaska Air Cargo, their website, and try to get registered as a known shipper, this is going to make it much easier on you. The other nice thing with Alaska Air Cargo is with all of their infrastructure, they generally are going to have freezers and cold storage as well. So a scenario or an example would be When we did our caribou hunt in Alaska as part of the experience project last fall, our meat was not fully frozen. And we actually checked it into Alaska Air Cargo the day before. Not only we were flying home, but also the day before the flight we booked for the meat was leaving Alaska. But as a meat item, you can declare that. They have the facility to put that in the freezer. So essentially we checked it in on call it day 0 with Alaska Air Cargo, dropped it off. They put it in a freezer in cold storage. It's there the rest of that day, overnight, and all up to the following day when it's going to get on a plane and then fly home. The way that we packaged on that hunt, and I've done this numerous times as well, is just with totes, like heavy duty totes. The black tote with the yellow lid, you can get at Home Depot, Lowe's, many other stores, I'm sure, sometimes under the brand HDX, which I think is the Home Depot brand. But get those. You could line them with Reflectix, which is a insulation material to help keep them cold. Again, this goes back to the condition of your meat, how long you're going to fly, etc. But if your meat's frozen solid and you have a good flight timeline, and another thing to look at is if your flight is making any sort of like transfers, does the transferring airport have cold storage? That's another thing to look at, not only for the transfer, but also your destination. Not every place that Alaska would fly to is going to have cold storage. Most major hubs do, of course. So like when we dropped off meat in Alaska, they held cold storage. The next destination was Seattle. I made a transfer there. They have cold storage. If there's any sort of delay, not a problem. They have cold storage. If you get to certain destination airports, such as Boise, for example, they're not going to have cold storage. So you not only need to know that to look at your transfers, you need to know that to look at your pickup time. Because if something arrives in, say, Boise, and you can't get there right away or that day or something to that effect, it arrived at Alaska Air Cargo, but they don't have cold storage for you. So that time is ticking. That's probably enough on Air Cargo. There's more details, but again, go look at their website, call them. They're actually pretty helpful on the phone if you call them. In terms of just checking meat, like, hey, I'm not Air Cargo, I just want to check meat for my personal flight home. Again, you can do that. Generally would want it to be frozen for sure. Just for these scenarios of one, it's going to make packaging easier. So you're not trying to put it in a cooler even. Like I mentioned, you could use those totes. You're not trying to add ice, of course, or any sort of form of that, because that can clearly turn into a liquid, which is going to be a no-go for flying. So if you can get meat frozen or darn near frozen, very, 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 very cold, you can look at checking it. Obviously, you're looking at overweight charges, which is going to depend on your carrier. And again, the animal and how much you're bringing home. Also, you can carry on meat with you. Here's where it really does need to be frozen. Again, I've heard of some exceptions of people saying they got by this, but the TSA rules and regulations essentially are worded in ways that non-frozen meat is not something that they will accept. I've carried on meat in a cooler numerous times. Like any other carry-on item, you have a size restriction, whether that's overhead bin or personal item. And then you don't necessarily have a weight restriction because they're not weighing when you go through TSA. So you can jam pack as much frozen meat as you can into a carry-on sized compatible cooler or something similar. Again, I've done this numerous times with a soft-sided backpack type cooler and just jam pack that sucker full of frozen meat. Again, non-frozen is where you get in trouble not only with the meat, but also with things like gel packs, obviously ice that can then turn into water. As you know, when you fly, they're Nazis about liquids, even just plain water. So you have to avoid all of that and just try to have frozen meat. And that's a way to get some home. So hopefully that's helpful. Doesn't answer every question, every scenario, Riley, but a few high-level things to look at. One is investigate Alaska Air Cargo. See if you can get registered to become a known shipper. 2 would be think through the logistics between the field and the airport to not only be able to get that meat kind of processed, if you will. I don't mean like full, like ready for the freezer processing. You could take that approach, but just to get it trimmed, get it cleaned, and then get it packaged in some form or fashion. And then also ideally having some time and capability in there to get it frozen or mostly frozen. All right. The next one is from James. He says, I need a new headlamp. My black diamond is several years old and I think it's time. He says, I watched the Experience Project video outlining what to look for, and now I'm looking for a podcast with the latest tests and recommendations. Any help is appreciated. So yeah, we did a discussion and article podcast as part of the Experience Project last year about headlamps for backpack hunting and kind of the unique demands of a headlamp for backpack hunting, and what to look for and kind of some must-have things from our experience perspective that headlamps should have in terms of features. Basic things like a red light mode is pretty much a make it or break it thing for me. Having several different modes or settings of the white, the main light. A lock is really a make it or break it thing. There's ways to get around not having a lock, such as taking a battery out or flipping a battery, what have you, but an integrated lock to make sure your headlamp doesn't come on in your pack. Things like weight and comfort, you're balancing weight, you look at from an in your pack perspective. We're always talking about how much does your gear weigh, but also just weight of the thing on your head, which may sound silly, but if you spent any time hiking with, let's say, a 2 to 3 to 4 ounce headlamp versus a 5-6 ounce headlamp over the course of hours, that becomes noticeably different in terms of comfort. Obviously, there's other factors of comfort, such as the headband style, construction, etc., not just the total weight, but that weight matters. And then looking for, hey, what's my situation, my plan for this headlamp running out of battery? So is it replaceable batteries? Is it rechargeable batteries? Is it a fully sealed system where the headlamp itself is rechargeable, but there's not a removable battery? And then if my headlamp dies and I need to use it and it's dead and I don't have a removable or swappable battery and I need to recharge my headlamp, can it be operational while it's charging, which still gets a little bit awkward because you have to somehow connect your power bank to your headlamp while you're wearing it. It's just not an ideal situation. So you need to think through all those types of factors. At the end of the day, we have done some headlamp tests years and years ago, like I think 2017 years ago, on things like runtime and light quality and all that good stuff. And it's easy to geek out. There's a whole subculture of people who are really into lighting, headlamps, flashlights, whatever, and really, really geek out on this stuff, which I guess could be fun. For me, I don't get to that level. I'm just looking for a headlamp that has the best balance of everything I just talked about. Red mode, white mode, different white modes, weight, comfort, a lock, recharging that's efficient, etc. And for me, the Phoenix HM50R V2, which is just version 2, is one of the headlamps. I probably got the first one maybe 3 years ago, at least 2 years ago. And I've continued to use other headlamps in that time, but none more than that Phoenix. And if I only had to own one headlamp and only had that Phoenix, I'd be a super happy guy. It's just a great headlamp for, I think it's $60, a great balance of total light output and power with good battery life at a moderate weight. I just absolutely love that headlamp. It's really comfortable. You can take the headlamp, like the light unit itself, off of the headband and use it independently, or set it up, or hang it in your tent, or do different things, which I don't admittedly do a ton, but it is a nice little feature I have used. There's a lot to like about it from my perspective, and nothing I don't really like about it. And so if you just say, hey, I'm looking for a new headlamp, what would you recommend? It's going to be that one for sure, by far. There's some other little cool aspects to it. It's a USB-C rechargeable on the headlamp itself, but also you can get the battery unit, like the actual battery cell, with a USB-C port. And so I carry the one headlamp with one battery pre-installed and then a secondary battery. I can swap those batteries, of course, at any time, but if I have a dead battery, I don't need anything other than a USB-C cable and my power bank, which I already have, to then charge that battery that's not in the headlamp. Another little bonus to this setup is the same battery type and size is what is required for my AirPad pump, which, again, if you're a podcast listener, there's been plenty of inside jokes about be a man and use your mouth and all that stuff. But on the trips where I do carry that Flextel Zero pad inflator, it's the same battery as my headlamp, so they actually share a battery. My second quote-unquote headlamp battery lives inside of my air pump, and then if my headlamp ever loses power, I'm just swapping from there, because obviously the air pump is, one, non-essential, but two, even though I'm using that secondary battery from a headlamp. If I use the pump is, pulling a minuscule amount of power out of that. And it's just another way to kind of have like dual purpose in the system, where there's some redundancy and backup without any sort of significant extra weight. So anyway, that's my headlamp recommendation. That Phoenix HMR 50 V2, killer light. Absolutely love it. Another new one that we've been testing, it's a bit different of a type. It's actually more like a black diamond in the sense that, just the style and the construction of it, but it's essentially a better version of it, is BioLite has a new, what they call their range series of headlamps. It's a fully sealed system, meaning you're not pulling the battery out of it. But what is unique about it is the way that they built the electronics. And I won't pretend to be the like engineer and go into knowing the how of all this, but essentially it's a fast charge technology. And so you can, again, a full sealed system, you can't take the battery out, but if this headlamp dies and you charge it for just 8 minutes, you actually get a full hour of runtime from that short 8-minute charge. Or additionally, it could go from 0% to 80% battery life in 30 minutes. So it is a different type of system, right? Where it's like, hey, if this thing's totally dead, I do need to charge it. I can't swap a battery. But what I will say is if you're remotely intentional about your use case, you can get a lot of life from a very, very short charge. And it's a cool little light. Again, red light, white light, really, really comfortable, just simple. It's waterproof. It's newer. Steve and I got our hands on them, I don't recall, late spring, early summer, but they actually didn't release them and we weren't allowed to talk about them until September. And we have been using them and really do like them. So that's one to check out as well. All right, on from headlamps, get into a question from Preston about puffy jackets. I'll read his whole email. He said, I would be curious to get your opinion on something. I love the look of the new Outdoor Vitals Alpine down jacket. However, I already own the KUIU Super Down Pro, and I use that as the weather drops, but I feel like it's overkill for early season hunts and summer scouting trips. The Alpine jacket from Outdoor Vitals seems to have similar specs to the KUIU Super Down Pro. Since I'm already using the Super Down Pro, I'm wondering if I should look at a lighter jacket, such as the KUIU Super Down LT, for those early season situations. Thanks for your input. So there's a lot here that doesn't correlate. I think in terms of, like, I can talk in a second about the Outdoor Vitals jacket. We can talk about the Super Down Pro, but at the end of the day, Preston, if you have the Super Down Pro and you want something lighter for earlier season, so you don't need as much insulation, then for sure the Outdoor Vitals is not what you want. The Outdoor Vitals should be warmer than the Super Down Pro, not necessarily lighter or, have less weight. From a really broad perspective, it's luxury is not the right word, but I'll use it for lack of a better term. It's a luxury. It's a kind of a non-necessity in many ways to have a lighter, like early season puffy and then a later season puffy. I'm not saying it's bad or wrong. It's just not always necessary. And for the vast majority of folks, I would say have one really good high quality puffy jacket that's more of an all season item. Then I would say, if budget's tight, like a couple mediocre, like, a mediocre light puffy and a mediocre colder weather heavier puffy. I would rather have one just really good one. And sure, in the early season, maybe it's quote unquote too warm, or, weighs a few more ounces than I need versus not. And I tend to obviously go towards the intention of a puffy jacket is to be warm and to keep you warm. Therefore, to say I have one that's too warm is like, I don't know, a little silly. But I totally get where Preston's coming from. I'm just pointing out, especially for guys who maybe are looking at gear, who are on a tight budget, etc. I wouldn't run out to spend, I don't even know, let's see what a Kuiu Super Down LT costs, which I don't know anything about them. So let's see, $300. So is it worth spending $300 to get a lighter puffy when you already have a really good puffy that's maybe a little bit too warm and a few ounces heavier than you need for an early season hunt? Like, that just depends if you have $300 to not put towards something else more beneficial, which for me is like, whatever. So I take the approach, like for me, the Outdoor Vitals Alpine Down Jacket, I've just taken that on all my backpack hunts, like spring bear, early fall bear. I took it when I was in August in Washington. I took it on September archery elk. Is it more than I need for those hunts? Yes, but it's still relatively light, really stinking packable, and just a great jacket. So I tend to have like one really good one. So that's my take. To get to your question, Preston, on, hey, if you already own the Super Down Pro and you want something lighter, like, yeah, if you have the budget for it, you want something lighter, the Super Down LT, I looked at it, it's going to save you, it looks like about 5-ish ounces in total pack weight. So yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And again, the Outdoor Vitals would not be a good choice. It's going to be more like the Super Down Pro you have. Stepping away from Preston's question for a second, just to talk about puffy jackets. I mentioned this before, but if you guys are new to this, it is a gear category where you can make some relatively objective, like kind of weight, warmth, price, budget type comparisons. Just mean at the end of the day, most of these jackets, if you take a puffy jacket, it's really, if you boil it down to simplicity, it's comprised of the fill, which is the down or the synthetic fibers, which is providing warmth. And then there's the shell, which is the material or the fabric that's holding that fill in place. So you're going to have different types of fill, such as down versus synthetic, which we'll leave for a discussion for a different day. And then you have fill power, which a basic premise here is the higher the fill power number, the more warmth to weight ratio you essentially have. So 850 fill isn't necessarily quote unquote warmer than a 700 fill. You could have two jackets that are equally as warm, but what you would notice is that the 700 fill power jacket, there's essentially going to be more weight there to achieve the same level of warmth as an 850. So think of fill power as like a warmth to weight ratio to simplify it. So in the case of the Super Down Pro, the Super Down LT, and the Outdoor Vitals, I'll just use those as examples because Preston mentioned them. they're all going to be 850 fill power. So the type or the efficiency of the down inside of those jackets is all 850. So now we can look at those and say, okay, well, how much of that 850 fill power down is there in each of those pieces? You should be able to find the amount of fill, not the type, not the fill power, but the amount of fill. If you're looking at a jacket and they don't list or won't provide the amount of fill in there, I would almost just say go the other way. Like, don't consider the jacket is my short answer. So the amount of fill, how much of this 850 fill power down is in these jackets? So in the Super Down Pro, there's 5 ounces. In the Super Down LT, there's 2.6. So right there, like off the bat, we can see you go from the Super Down Pro to the Super Down LT, you essentially have half the amount, roughly, to use a broad term, half the warmth. It's not that simple, but kind of. Half the amount of fill power, half the amount of insulation, half the amount of warmth when you go from the Pro to the LT. 5 ounces down to 2.6. If we want to compare the Outdoor Vitals, because he brought it up in here, there's 7.1 ounces of fill. So again, if we were to like say compare the Super Down Pro to the Outdoor Vitals, there's 2 more ounces, almost like 50 more percent of the same fill power, 850 fill power down, almost 50% more in there. So that tells us roughly the Outdoor Vitals jacket should be warmer. There's more insulation. There's more warmth to retain there. The other factor that comes into play when we look at the total weight of a piece, not the amount of down inside of it, but just the weight of the item, the one thing we can somewhat objectively start with is that shell material. What is it? How heavy is it? What denier fabric is it? So like on the Super Down Pro, it says they use a 30D exterior and a 12D interior. So the exterior lining is going to be heavier than the interior lining, which kind of makes sense because the exterior is like out. It's going to encounter the elements. It needs to be, in theory, more durable. The Outdoor Vitals, for example, is using 15 across the board. There's kind of some unique reasons that those match, and we can get to that in a second. So that's another thing to look at. It's like, okay, well, the Super Down Pro is going to be a 30D. The Outdoor Vitals is a 15D on the outside. Does that mean that the Outdoor Vitals is like half as tough? Because theoretically, it's half as like thick of a denier. I don't know if you can make that approach and say it's half as tough, but in theory, yes, it should be not quite as tough. This is where some guys kind of go off the board and is like, well, I don't want that. Again, we get where people are coming from, but think through the piece of a puffy jacket, what it is and what it's for. A really warm puffy, again, like the Super Down Pro, the Outdoor Vitals, these are really warm pieces. You should not be moving in them. So how much of a concern is durability if you shouldn't be like hiking and brush busting and all of that when wearing one of these pieces? Good question. Think through that for yourself. I hardly ever hike in a puffy, even when it's really cold. If it's really cold, I'm generally wearing just my base layer and mid layer when I'm hiking. If I'm hiking and I need some extra protection, if it's a true late season, it's like it could be not only really cold, but really windy, etc. That's making it feel even colder. I'm generally going to have some sort of shell with me, whether that's just a rain jacket or a light wind shell, and I would be hiking in that and still not in my puffy. Especially a really warm puffy, you just can't move much in it without massively overheating and creating other issues. So for me, the durability isn't a huge, it's just not the primary deciding factor in a piece. So again, if you look at fill power and the amount of fill, and then you start looking at the fabrics, you can make some logical conclusions on warmth and the total weight of a piece. There certainly can be other things that affect the weight of a piece, such as additional features. So you'll see puffy jackets with external chest pockets with a zipper. You see some puffy jackets with zippered pit zips. Again, because you're not moving them. I think that's insane. There's different things that can affect the weight of a piece, but in general, I would start by looking at fill power, amount of fill, and then fabrics. And you can begin to kind of judge why a total piece weighs what it does and kind of some comparisons on how warm it should be, etc. I hope that makes sense. When it comes to, puffy jackets, our whole take has been keep it simple, and you want as much warmth for as little weight as possible. Obviously, we have zero, I don't know and don't care how many puffy jackets Outdoor Vitals is going to sell. I care in the sense that I hope it does well for them, but there's no financial incentive there, but we definitely had design input. And so our whole goal was how warm of a puffy can we make for roughly 16 ounces in a size large? And that means we didn't add a bunch of extra features. We didn't add a bunch of external pockets, pit zips, other just unnecessary stuff. That got away from Preston's question. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, though, if you want a lighter lightweight puffy for earlier season, you don't want to look at the Outdoor Vitals, and you don't necessarily need the Super Down Pro. So something like that Super Down LT should be helpful. I would just question packability. Even the really warm jackets, especially obviously the down ones, not the synthetic, they're just going to compress so well. Packability is not a huge factor. So it really just boils down to, is it a good, personal use of your money to have that extra item? All right. Last question, not an easy one, not a gear one, but Matthew wrote in. He said, I listened to your podcast about losing your bull. This weekend, I got out after 4 years of general archery elk hunting with no success. He says, I took an 18-yard shot on a 5x5 bull. It was epic, and I buried the arrow mid-body. However, I looked for 2 days, no blood, no arrow. I'm absolutely gutted, and I'm having trouble viewing it as a positive. How did you handle the emotions? Yeah, so if you guys didn't hear, I did arrow a bull this archery season, did not recover it. You can go back, hear more details about that if you want. But in terms of how did I handle it, one, losing an animal is never easy for a bunch of reasons. I freaking love elk. I enjoy hunting them. I don't mind killing them. I love that I can feed my family with an elk, but no part of me wants to injure, wound, kill, and not recover an elk. That alone just is, that's terrible. To go along with that, or in addition to that, other things that make it difficult, a difficult situation to arrow a bull and not recover it is just, it's such a special opportunity to have to hunt them, period. But then to create situations where you get a shot opportunity are difficult. You've invested so much time in practicing, preparing, you're spending money, you're traveling, you're spending a lot of time and effort and energy in the field. Encounters are tough to come by, or you could have a lot of encounters but no shot opportunities, and then you finally get the shot opportunity and you release an arrow, and it's there's so much that goes into that single moment and single arrow, and for that to then not yield a positive result, that's really freaking tough. That's even tougher for Matthew asking when he's been hunting elk for 4 years with no success. That's freaking hard, man. I don't like that. That's really hard. And then he absolutely says he's gutted and he's having trouble viewing it as positive. Yeah, I have trouble viewing that as a positive. Not that there can't be good things that come out of it, but part of what I struggled with the bull I lost this year, and maybe similar with Matthew, like he said, it was an 18-yard shot, and he buried the arrow mid-body. I'm assuming by mid he means like elevation-wise, and hopefully is in a good left or right as well. So it's like you didn't necessarily know what you screwed up or what to learn from it, right? So if you have a situation where it's like, hey, I lost a bull because I did X, like I rushed a shot, I should have ranged and didn't, I whatever, like I insert the thing that I screwed up on and therefore I can learn from. So it's like, okay, well, in a positive way, like one of the positive things, not that this is a positive situation still, it's not, but to find something positive you can take away from it is, hey, I did X and therefore I learned that lesson and do not ever want to do X again. In my situation, again, I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I'm still trying to piece together what I learned. I'm still trying to piece together what I should have done differently. And maybe in Matthew's case, he's in the same spot. So it's like you're struggling, especially to come up with something positive because you're not quite sure, like, what should I have done differently? Like, I don't know if I'm coming to this with a lesson to learn. So that makes it tough. His question of how did you handle the emotions? I mean, for me, shortly afterwards, while everything's fresh and you're really second guessing everything, you're going to have more emotions. It's been a few weeks now, almost a month now. It's still really hard. It still bothers me. It still comes to mind when I'm not trying to think about it. But obviously with a month passing, I'm not thinking about it as much as I did a day afterwards. And then this isn't, again, this isn't like to minimize everything else, but you also just have to intentionally choose to look at, this isn't life. Like at the end of the day, it's maybe, or maybe not, the elk's life. Like maybe they're out there walking. I don't know in Matthew's situation. But this isn't your life. Like you are not defined as a human, and your worth is not all wrapped up in killing that bull or not. Which I know we know in the moment, but so many of us tie our identity as like really passionate hunters to outcomes or actions that we make then as hunters. Like hunters identify as hunters, meaning we're saying this is what we are or who we are. And that can be taken to an extreme, especially on the negative side when something doesn't come out and then you just start, again, I'm not saying he's quite questioning his whole life. What I am saying is step aside from this very difficult thing that is bothering you a great deal. And I'm not saying it shouldn't bother you, but just step outside of that and have some perspective. So immediately for me, coming home from that elk hunt, I had to very intentionally, even though I was bummed by the outcome, I had to come home not only for myself, but for my family and for life and be positive and go, I'm coming home to an amazing family, to people that I love. I live in a country that, obviously has some problems, but is still the best place on earth to live. I'm healthy. There's so many great things. It's so easy to get wrapped up in negativity, and you just have to choose to look at everything else that's positive. So that's in part how I've been dealing with it. Going back to like the positive aspect of what do you take away from it, even if it's not a very specific, as I talked about, lesson learned or thing not to do, is it still should influence you as a hunter to be more effective. Again, whether you can or can't point to a specific thing that went wrong, it just is a very realistic reminder of what's at stake and how every detail matters and the ultimate responsibility we have as hunters to do everything within our control to not only have a positive outcome for ourselves or put meat in the freezer, but again, for the respect of the animals, to just do everything we can. So it does and should still create like a desire to constantly improve, and to treat the pursuit, with some seriousness there. So it's freaking tough, man. Yeah, I don't want to minimize it, especially because, all the years, like that shot opportunity wasn't just a few months of work or a few days of hard hunting, but it's years in the making for you. And so, it's difficult for that not to come together. But, I would encourage you to keep after it. Almost going back to like what we talked about in the beginning, separate hunting success or whatever, but just this pursuit of things in our lives that are difficult, that push us out of our day-to-day. Like you're going to have a more fulfilling life by pursuing things like that, whether that's archery, elk hunting, or something else. And so if archery, elk hunting is one of those things for you that is going to create memories and challenge you and allow you to make the most of your short years, then freaking keep after it and don't give up. We'll wrap it there today, guys. I hope that was helpful and not too rambly, being solo. It's rare that I do this, but with Steven out moose hunting, I didn't just want to drop the ball either. So hopefully you took something away from this one. If you have any questions for us for future Monday Minutes, if you have any hunt stories to share, any guest or topic suggestions or anything like that, always feel free to reach out to us directly. Just send an email to podcast@exomountaingear.com. If you're new to the show or maybe just haven't done it yet, be sure to hit subscribe or follow in your podcast app so that you receive future episodes automatically. We generally are going to have a Monday Minute every week, which are these Q&A episodes. Again, not normally solo. And then generally on Wednesdays are going to have a full-length episode. It could be a listener hunt story. It could be a very in-depth, like topic-specific discussion with an expert, etc. So that's what you'll get if you follow the Hunt Backcountry podcast. We have hundreds and hundreds of episodes in the archive, which you can always access at exomountaingear.com/podcast. You can browse by category, search by keyword, all that good stuff, and get everything there. Thanks so much for supporting the show, and we'll talk to you soon.